Go, Angie.
Hello, everybody. I'm Angie Abdou. Who's Javian by birth and upbringing, but I'm coming to you today from the Rocky Mountains, and I'm very delighted to be interviewing Joan Thomas about Five Wives. First, I'm going to begin by acknowledging that this festival is located on Treaty 4 territory, the original lands of the Cree, the Ojibwe, the Saulteaux, the Dakota, the Nakota, the Lakota, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. And I'm coming from Ktunaxa territory today. We respect and honor the treaties made on all territories and acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past. We're committed to moving forward in partnership with Indigenous nations in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. We also want to emphasize that the festival is dedicated to making this a safe space for anyone. Hateful language will not be tolerated in the events or in the online chat. And of course, I want to take a moment to thank the sponsors. An extra big thank you this year since they adjusted to the online format and were willing to continue supporting the festival during these hard times for all businesses and these uncertain times for everybody. So without the sponsors, the festival could not be happening. Thank you to the Saskatchewan Arts Board, Sask Culture, and then there's also a long list of program funders that we'll show at the end of the event on the screen. And if you are in Moose Jaw and you visit any of the businesses that support the festival, please take a moment to thank them in person for helping keep this wonderful event going every year. And next year will be the 25th year. So here we are, the 24th year, and I'm so happy to be involved. And I was delighted to be asked to interview Joan because she's one of my favorite writers. And I think we as Prairie people really celebrate the successes of our own people. So as I've watched her career over the year, I could have been envious. I could have thought, wow, she's doing so great and being envious as a writer, but I always just felt pure pleasure at how well she's doing and how much recognition she's getting, and was so thrilled to see her wonderful novel win the Governor General's Award this year. So it's my pleasure to introduce Joan Thomas. I know it's not her first Festival of Words because I have had the privilege of sharing an event with her at least once. I can picture us both up on the museum stage, which where I wish we were right now. But we were in Crescent Park on the museum stage, and she did a beautiful slideshow about her novel at the time. So I know she's no stranger to Moose Jaw audiences, and that you are all well aware that everything she touches turns to gold, literary gold. She has written 4 books: Reading by Lightning in 2008, Curiosity in 2010, Opening Sky in 2014, and now Five Wives in 2020. All 4 have been critically acclaimed and won major awards, everything from winning the first Amazon First Novel Award to being nominated for the Giller Prize and the Impact Dublin Award, and winning a Commonwealth Literature Prize, and most recently the prestigious Governor General's Award. She is one of the most important novelists writing in our country today. She lives and writes from Winnipeg, Manitoba. In the Globe and Mail, Russell Smith said that this new book, Five Wives, put her in the company of Alice Munro. He said this book puts her in the Alice Munro's league, which I think is as high as praise gets in Canada, and it's very well deserved. It's a truly brilliant and astonishing novel. The Governor General's Committee writes of it, Thomas's tale provides a nuanced examination of Operation Alqua, a historical event that took place in Ecuador in 1956. This book raises important questions about religious fervor, autonomy, and legacies of violence. Ambitiously conceived and beautifully written, this book is a masterful achievement. And today we have Joan herself here to talk with us about this truly masterful achievement. Welcome, Joan.
Oh, thank you so much. What a lovely introduction. I'm also remembering being at Sage Hill with you a long time ago when we were both.
Oh, and you're in Robert Croach's group. That was so long ago.
Yeah.
That was before I had kids, so it feels like a different lifetime.
True, and I hadn't published at that time. I'm not sure if you had. But
no, I hadn't. We were probably both working on our first novels. I was working on The Bone Cage, and you were working on Opening
by Lightning.
Reading by Lightning. And Robert Croach was at the time, he just got inducted into the Order of Canada while we were there.
That's right.
That's a lovely place, Sage Hill.
Yeah.
And so you have had a very exciting time with this novel right out of the gates, with it winning the Governor General's Award. And you told me in a conversation that the book was actually not supposed to be out until this coming fall, but it got raced ahead. How come it came out early?
I'm not sure. The publisher just contacted me in November and said, we were aiming for 2020, but we see a little gap in our schedule for 2019, and we think it's close to being ready. How would you feel about about shooting for that. So I'm just delighted that we did, because it made a huge difference to have last fall.
And I've never heard of that happening before. Usually books get delayed, so I've never heard of it.
It's true. I've never really heard the inside story about why that happened, but I got really lucky for sure.
And before we dive into the meat of the novel, and it is a very meaty novel, but before we go there, I'd like to know how it felt to win the Governor General's Award, and how important these kind of recognition and award is to your life as a writer.
Oh, it was just unbelievable. It was really fabulous. I mean, I think all writers have a bit of a love-hate relationship with the prizes, because so many people put a lot of weight on those lists. And if your book doesn't make it onto the list, it can be a little bit tough to get the same amount of attention. But when it does, it just feels like a gift. It's hard to get readers in Canada. It's hard to publicize books, and it's just that extra boost. So it was wonderful. And I have to say, I feel the confidence of it as I'm writing now. I kind of feel, okay, yeah, I can.
Well, that's so nice that you can be this stage of your career, middle career, and feel confident. Like, I'm a award-winning, acclaimed writer, and you can come to the page with that confidence. That's well-deserved and lovely to hear.
Thank you.
Congratulations. So the book is based around true events, which is very interesting. This group, Operation Alca, went to Ecuador with the intent of converting the savages to Christianity, to use their language, and then 5 of the missionary men were killed. And it's told from the point of view of the wives, some of the wives, and one photographer. I want to understand what attracted you to telling the story of a true event, this 1956 massacre.
Well, that particular true event, I was drawn back to when I read a major feature in the New Yorker about the politics of oil in Ecuador, because this indigenous nation and others were suing the oil companies for leaving pools of tar. And when I read this story, I thought, I wonder if I knew the story of the missionaries from when I was a child, and I thought, I wonder if any of these indigenous nations are the ones that they contacted. And then I wanted to connect the dots. And when I did connect the dots, it had such an emotional impact on me, because this story in my childhood was just revered. You know, we don't have saints really in evangelical churches, but if we did, these missionaries would be regarded as saints. It's a story that has a lot of mythology around it. And so suddenly to see it in the context of, in a secular context, in the context of the damage that was done to these people, it really made me want to revisit it, look at it from a different perspective.
And so you grew up knowing the story because you were raised in an evangelical household, and you had the book, the memoir of one of the wives.
Yes. Actually, a lot of people in the prairies know this story because Elizabeth Elliot, who was the most prominent writer among these missionaries, went to Bible college in Three Hills, Alberta. And there's a chapel there named after her. So even though the enterprise was largely American, there was that Canadian tie-in, and a lot of evangelical churches always had ministers who went to Three Hills, Alberta for Bible school, and so they, were interested in Elizabeth Elliot, and yeah, it was huge when I was growing up. Reader's Digest did a condensed version of 2 of her books, so even in the mainstream press, the story was known.
And it still sells well, you mentioned in your own.
It does, yeah. Through Gates of Splendor, it's sold 500,000 copies. So, yeah, it's still in print. It's never been out of print.
And it's interesting that you say they're viewed as saints within the church, because in your novel, they see themselves as saints. They're martyrs, at least. They're dying for the cause of bringing Christianity to places where Christianity doesn't exist. And you get right in their mind in a way that's not judgmental. I mean, we can see that what they do is misguided, or I can see as a reader that what they do is misguided compared to my ideologies and morals. But you allow me to understand what was going on in their minds and what made them think that this was the right thing to do. Would you say they're well-intentioned?
Well, I often think of that word because it is the word that people use to apply to ministries like that. And I hesitate a little bit even to say well-intentioned, because I think the premise was wrong. To believe that you have the only true way, and that these people who have lived in the rainforest for probably 6,000 years, which is a lot longer than Christianity has existed, to believe that they are wrong and will perish unless you take your way to them. I see that as, I have so much trouble with that as a premise. So I struggle even with the word well-intentioned. But of course, they were courageous and thoughtful and not unintelligent. The review that you cited from the Globe and Mail sort of said we're inside the minds of crazy people, and I don't think that's true.
No, I think there were people who really believed God was telling them what to do.
Yes, and I think all of us live in certain kinds of bubbles and embrace worldviews that are misguided, and so I don't like to. I guess I don't have the luxury of seeing them as profoundly different from me. And if I had empathy for them, it's because I know what it is to live with that much cognitive dissonance, where the world is giving you information, but it doesn't fit with your ideology. And so there's a real stress to that. And I think I wanted to explore that.
Yes, and I think when I asked the question about well-intentioned, I think I'm getting at something that the book is not about Canada, it's about these American missionaries who are in Ecuador. But for me, there is a resonance with our own situation. Like, people have defended residential schools on the basis of those people were well-intended. So horrible atrocities have been committed on the basis of people who are supposedly well-intentioned. So you're right, it's not a useful word, but in their own hearts, I think they would have described themselves that way.
Absolutely. And, when I had a lot of admiration for so many aspects of their ministry, the medical work they did. And, I met a man who had worked as a child for the Elliots, two of the missionaries in an Ecuadorian village. And he spoke of them with so much affection and love. He said, their hearts were broken when the men died. And it was, I had to always keep that in mind as well, that there was a lot of self-sacrifice, as misguided as I see it as being.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that you came back to the story because of reading about the oil industry in Ecuador, and Shell is a character in your book, and the things Shell is doing in Ecuador comes up. And where is the intersection? Like, how do you compare the missionaries' work in Ecuador with the oil companies' work in Ecuador?
Oh, that's a really good question. It's not, when you grow up reading these missionary accounts, they're so focused on the religious imperative. And I never saw it until I did research. I never saw it in the context of the sort of resource plundering of the Amazon. But in fact, the two kind of worked hand in glove, because the oil companies used the missionaries in a certain way as an advance guard to ensure a more peaceful entry for the oil companies into the rainforest. I mean, they had pulled out once because so many of their engineers were killed. But once the missionaries went in, the missionaries actually took oil company flights into the more remote areas, and because they spoke the language by then, implored other clans to come out to what they called a protectorate. So they played a very active role in drawing the indigenous people out of the rainforest so the oil companies could go in. And at that time, they would justify that. They would say, we had to help them move more peacefully into the future that was inevitable anyway.
Oh, and I'm thinking of the line you say in your author's note at the end, that on every page you were thinking of Wade Davis's statement that other cultures are not a failed attempt at being you. You have to remember that. And that's what all of that, missionaries and oil companies, I suppose, go in with that mindset that these indigenous cultures are a failed attempt at being them.
Yeah, I would say they do. And, when I look back on it now too, and think of the stories I heard as a child, I think that there was a real demonizing of the Waorani to kind of justify everything that happened. I look at my bookshelf of memoirs and journals, and I think 4 of them have the word savage in the title. And so it was almost like the missionaries wanted to find a mission that was dangerous and glamorous enough to justify any risk that they took. They really did create a bit of a cult around the Irani people as being so incredibly violent.
And you capture that in the book, the way they talk about the Irani people. But then in your author's note, or maybe it was a different article I read, you said that you actually backed off from some of the language because you found it just too hard. So you just didn't put in some of the worst comments people had made about these people.
I mean, I don't think the missionaries were out of line with mainstream culture in 1956, but of course we're all in this inflection point now where, I even question, even if I'm quoting people who are racist, it has an impact in the text. And so I did dial language back. Yeah.
And you may actually, before I ask you about your decision of whose point of view not to write from, I want to ask you about your decision of whose point of view you did write from. So as soon as you decided, okay, there's enough material here for a novel, I really want to engage with this material in a novel. Did you know at that point that you were going to write from the women's point of view, or did that decision come later?
I think I almost took it for granted at the beginning. The men's point of view is far better represented in some ways because we have their journals and so on. Although I shouldn't say that, because Elizabeth Elliot had a huge role in shaping this narrative. She's she's a fantastic writer, actually, and had a very powerful presence in evangelical Christianity until her death a few years back. But I was always interested in the women. And then, of course, I had the possibility of just doing the 5 women. And a lot of people read the title and think that's what I'm going to do. But somehow I needed other counter perspectives and other voices. And so I ended up using Cornell Kappa, who is a real person, the photographer that went in. And I also use a fictional son of the Saint family. So, I always wanted to explore the women because when you read about them, it's so moving. They will say in many different ways, we felt no doubt. We were totally on board with this. We were all on the same page. And yet I look at them, they were these lovely young women in their 20s with 9 small children among them. And I just found it so moving to see how they had to conform their own wishes and anxieties and so on to this enterprise, which was kind of like a speeding train. Once it started going, the men were just so gung-ho about the whole thing.
And you really capture the extent to which they're devoted to this cause and to their notion of God. When their husbands are killed, they don't even want to show sorrow, because if they show sorrow, it might imply that they're doubting God's plan for them and that this was part of God's plan. Now they're martyrs for the cause, which is so, that was really struck me. I mean, it's
and that came straight from their writings. That was absolutely the culture that they were moving in as a group.
I thought, as I started reading, I wondered if it might be too many characters to keep track of, and if they were too similar, because but then I had no trouble keeping track of, because you have 5 men, 5 wives, and quite a gang, I think you call them, with all their kids. But even though they're devoted to the same cause, they all have just enough of a difference that it became very easy to distinguish them as characters and remember them.
Well, I do see complaints on Goodreads that there's so many characters. And I think we should have put a list at the front of the book. Maybe.
No.
But I will say that when I was writing, they seemed so different to me. They really did. Each point of view. When I got to Marge, I just thought, she spends her whole day looking after little kids and the domestic scene. How will this be interesting? And she was so interesting to me. She, as a character, she really did feel complex. And I felt grateful for that. It felt like the muse kind of gave me those different personalities.
And their relationships with their husbands are different, and I found them quite easy to keep. And then then you have the whole present frame, which we should talk about. So you decided to stick with real historical figures for the main story, and then for the present day frame, you made up the children. Yeah. The children are fictional. How come you decided to make the contemporary?
A little bit unusual to mix, but I did not want to research living family. It felt intrusive to me, and yet I wanted to look at the resonance of this story for today. And so I I just took the liberty of creating a son. And actually, I have him as a son of 2 of the missionary families, and that such a marriage never happened. A saint child did not marry a child of the Elliots. And so that's clearly fictional. But I really wanted to look at how they were both living with that legacy and also the meaning of that whole doctrine in present day politics. I was writing this, when America was locking up families at the southern border and trying so hard to prevent immigrants from coming in, and yet churches are still sending missionaries to Central and South America. It just seems so ironic to me. So I really wanted to have a presence in today to look at that whole thing.
To me, the contemporary frame was also really important from I'm going to say from a metafictional point of view. And my husband, who is not a bookish kind of person, makes fun of me when I use words like metafictional, but I just mean that it's a story about story writing. So it drew attention to how do we recover this story? It's a thing that really happened, but we recover it. You start with the wives trying to piece together the stories with memorabilia, and then you have the filmmaker trying to tell the story, and you have David, what he knows, or even right after the men die, the reason they know they die is from radio silence. So the silence is telling the story. And then we get the camera and how much of those images can be preserved and what story can we get from that. So it's kind of this piecing together bits to try to arrive at the truth, which is what you're doing as a novelist. So I thought without that frame, you wouldn't have that layered approach to the story, the complex idea of what it is to put together this story.
Well, those are lovely observations. I love the way you read the book. I think when I started, I wasn't conscious of that, but it became really important to me because I thought even of Elizabeth Elliot's storytelling, that she shaped that narrative such that the men were ever after viewed as martyrs, and it was used as a recruiting tool for bringing other young people to South America as missionaries. So, it is a lot about story, and even them going in is about narrative. They're going in with this narrative about, the Son of God who 2,000 years ago came to earth to die for your sins. It's a narrative that they want to take to the Waorani people. So, yeah, I think it's absolutely at the heart of the book.
And then the language is another issue in the story because they don't understand the Waorani language, of course, but they think they do, and they get it all wrong. And, they're listening to tapes of someone speaking when they don't understand the words. They're trying to take meaning from that, or they think they're saying something to them, but it's not understood. And so, even and then the really interesting when the scene where you have about how would the Bible be translated into this language? And you talk about, maybe I'll let you talk about that, the evidentiality of the verb tenses and how that affects the translation of the Bible.
Right. Well, Elizabeth Elliot was quite a good linguist, and she at one point talks to Cornell Kappa about the verb endings in Indigenous languages in South America. And I think this is true of most South American Indigenous languages, that they have a verb case, no, that's nouns, a verb ending anyway, that tells you what is the evidence for this. Is it by hearsay? Did you experience it yourself? And they have trouble sort of framing, I've read about this in other books too, they have trouble framing the gospel for Indigenous people because according to the rules of evidentiality, they don't have any authority to be talking about the gospel. They didn't see Jesus. It's all hearsay. And that comes out even in the verbs you use. But I also saw the New Testament that the missionaries had translated in the museum in Shandia in Ecuador. And it's like 6 inches high because so many of the words are compound words because the whole culture is so different than what Indigenous people in the rainforest know. I mean, they didn't know money at that time. They, sheep, cross, all kinds of words are totally foreign to them. And so it just speaks of what, what a imposition this was, what an imposing of a different culture.
Totally different mindset. Yes. When you reminded me when you're talking about how, in fact, the mission is bringing a story to them, and that's how central the role of storytelling is. it reminded me that not having been exposed necessarily to people this branch of religion before, when I'm reading the way they look at things as you represent them, they're almost looking at their own lives as a story told by God, and they're just waiting to see what conclusion God writes for them. They're just passively observing the story that's been written for them.
That's a really lovely observation. I think you're right. I think you're right for sure. They were very aware of legacy, and yeah, and I mean, I was kind of I always saw it in the context of the times too, that three of them were from a church where they were pacifists. They weren't involved in World War II. And this was, you know, a huge adventure for them. They were writing this adventure story. They built a clubhouse back on the banks of the river, and they had code and all kinds of.
They're so young. They're like kids.
Of boys' culture. That's right. Yeah, and it was very militaristic in the language as well.
I wonder, so when I was seeing all these things in my reading, the emphasis on story and consequence of story and responsibility of telling story, I wondered, how did you think very consciously about your responsibility in telling this particular story?
I did. I just did a workshop on the other night for the festival on writing from history, and we talked, as much as you can talk virtually to a group, talked about what our responsibility is to the facts of history. And I will say that I felt the family's eyes upon me as I was writing this. I wanted to be respectful. I did not invent anything that was incongruent with the historical record. I didn't set out to smear them. And some of the things that I write about are not in the missionary stories, but they're in, Wade Davis has a book that deals partly with the Waorani, and there's other secular sources, and there's Waorani oral histories, and they give a different perspective, for example, on the fact that the missionary man used a gun, and the missionaries never, in their main writings, there's something more recent that has acknowledged that, but initially they did not. And so, I was careful, I think, to I tried to explore the kinds of things they might not acknowledge to themselves in terms of their thoughts and feelings, but I didn't impose negative fact.
Have you heard from any of the family, the living family?
The book is not available in the US yet. So the only comment I've had, it was kind of interesting. Nate Saint's grandson came to Winnipeg last year and spoke at a missions conference. He's still involved in this mission in Ecuador. And a lot of people thought that I should go and meet him, and I didn't do that, but people pressed my book on him. And then they reported back to me, and they said that when he took the stage, he said, "I understand a Winnipeg writer has written a book about my family's mission. I think I can accurately summarize it in one word: fiction."
Oh, good. That's fine.
Yes, absolutely.
I could talk to you all day long about this book and about writing, but I do want to look at your pictures in a moment, and then move to Q&A. But I want to ask one question. One thing that struck me the most in this book, and I think I've already said this, is how you were able to write without judgment, to the extent that I didn't even really get a sense of you in the book. And that made it seem quite miraculous. Like you made all these people appear, but you weren't there. So, I couldn't get a sense of where you fit, which is perfect because it's not about you. But I'll tell you two places where I thought I saw your opinion sneak through. And I think they'll be unexpected to you. And you can tell me if you think if I'm right or not. Okay. One place, there is an editor meeting, and she has her briefcase stacked full of manuscripts. And the guy says to her, "What are the books about?" And she says, "Oh, they're about adultery, of course. What else?" And I thought, Joan does not like books about adultery. And so
is that right?
That's what I thought. That's one place I thought I saw you. And it made me think, just to make this into more of a deeper question, it made me think of John Valiant says, "A mighty book needs a mighty theme." And that if you're going to write important literature, you really have to find a meaty theme or which this book so very much is. And it made me wonder, and I'm asking you this as a writer looking for advice, do you think you need a mighty theme? Can books be about smaller domestic things? Do you not like books about adultery?
Well, The Opening Sky, my 2014 novel, is about adultery in one thread, for sure.
Yeah.
I don't know if there are books, serious literary fiction that doesn't have a mighty theme. Even when you're dealing with domestic subjects, you're dealing with people's place in the world and their human consciousness. So I don't distinguish one from the other. I guess, that's kind of in the tradition of a lot of women prairie writers that dealt with women's lives. And
Yes.
I would assert that that is a mighty theme. So I don't really distinguish.
Good. I'll take that permission to continue on in my book about adultery.
Absolutely.
The other place I felt when Abby, I feel like you identify with Abby more. Is that true?
For sure. For sure.
Maybe it's just because I was identifying with Abby. Abby's the daughter of the son. David is the son in the contemporary frame, and Abby is David's daughter, so the granddaughter of these people. And she doesn't believe in God so much anymore, and she questions the mission a lot. And she, at the end, where she's talking about the beliefs of the Waharani people. So it's the first time we see some of their actual beliefs. And she talks about one belief where it says a person can change so much bit by bit that eventually they're not even the same person. They're fundamentally a different person. And I felt like that idea appealed to you. But maybe I'm connecting my own. And so I'd like you to talk about why you included that belief and if it applies to the story in a larger sense.
Yes. Well, I love that you've picked that up, Angie. That's great. And I loved it when I read this about Waorani culture, that they literally believed that a person could become a different person and need to be renamed. And there certainly is that idea in this book with Abby, especially the granddaughter who has grown up so wanting to please her parents and so wanting to be a good daughter and devoutly follow. And I know I was working out my own story in telling her story. And I think I told you when we talked prior to this interview that I had about 50 extra pages of Abby because I just went crazy writing her story and then had to pare it down a little bit so that it fit. But yeah, it really is about it's a mammoth task to re-find yourself in the wider world when you have had a lot of indoctrination as a child. And I think that theme of the indoctrination of children really runs through the book as well with other characters and their children. Yeah.
I do want to show the pictures. So just for the everybody listening, there's a scene after the men have been killed. They recover a camera and they think that they can't get the film developed and they'll never know what's on the camera. And it looks like it's been water damaged anyways. But a photographer takes the camera and goes into the dark room and they recover some of the images. And when I was reading, I very much wondered if these images existed because you talk about photography in a really interesting way as another kind of storytelling, I think. And so I wanted there to be these images, and it turns out the images are all real, and that's true. So Joan is going to share some of those pictures with us and talk about them. And then at 1:45, we'll stop for questions.
Okay. Actually, just the first one I'm showing is from that film, but people can see the others online. You just Google Operation Auca, and they're quite available. So let's see if I can get them up here.
And Auca, for people who haven't read the book yet, is AUCA.
Right.
There. Now, this is the money shot, as you call it in the book, or your photographer calls it in the book.
Right. So, as this isn't a spoiler to tell people who haven't read the book that in the preface, the wives are reflecting on the fact that when the men were camping on the riverbank, three Auca people, as they called them at that time, came out of the rainforest and visited the men for a day. And it was just an astonishingly moving experience for the men. They hardly knew what to do. They started entertaining them with, a harmonica and blowing up balloons, and they had no common language really. But this is one of the pictures they took. So that's Nate Saint, the missionary pilot. And this is a man named Kiwi. And I love it. I just love the composition of it, the contrasts and similarities.
And in the book, it comments that he's eating a hamburger and the hand reaching in is putting bug spray on him. So it's like they couldn't get North American culture into him fast enough.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. And they
it's a reminder of how young these missionaries were.
Yeah. I think Nate was the eldest and he was about 33. So, yeah. So, this is Ed McCulley, and Peter Fleming and Jim Elliott. And this is, the men were doing gift drops from the plane, and they actually Nate Saint had figured out a method for spiraling a bucket down by a rope. And so they would put gifts in it. It sounds technologically very tricky, but they were successfully doing it. And the Waorani started to send gifts back. So this was a living parrot that they sent back. And I really like this picture. These guys were real, interesting, high achieving, high functioning individuals. Their writing is quite amazing. Ed McCully here he won a National Oratory Award. He left law school to go on this mission. And Peter Fleming was about to do graduate work in philosophy. Jim Elliot was widely known through North America as a preacher and writer. So they were very, very accomplished young men. And I wanted to put in a few pictures of the wives too. This is the McCully family. And when I look at these pictures, it's my parents' era with young children. I'm just so moved at what ordinary, happy families were involved in this. And this is Elizabeth Elliot, a picture that Cornell Kappa, the Life magazine photographer, took. He did a portrait of each of the wives right after the killing. And her little daughter, Valerie Elliot. This was there's a scene in the book where Cornell Kappa first meets Elizabeth. She comes out and stands under a tree one night and he runs into her. And this was how I pictured her in that scene. A year after the killings, the women were all back in Ecuador and 4 of them stayed. Olive Fleming is in the middle. She did not. She had only been there a few months. She was the youngest and she went home. But this is 7 of the 9 children. So Angie, can you guess who is who here?
I don't know if I can. No.
Well, Mary Lou's on the left, and then Barbie Darien, Olive Fleming, Elizabeth Elliot, and Marge Saint.
Do you have a picture of Rachel? Because Rachel's the woman that's not the wife and is very excluded from them for many reasons. But I found her such an interesting character too.
She really is. Yeah, I have a picture of her with 2 of the Waorani people. So she ended up, because they did go in and make peaceful contact, eventually the women did after the men were dead, she ended up living among the Waorani people until she died. And this is a picture that I think, elicits rather strong emotions, sort of makes you cringe in a sense, because this is Rachel on the right. And these are 2 of the Waorani men that she did this several times. She took Waorani people to North America, or in this case to Berlin, to missions conferences and fundraising junkets. And it's kind of painful too. One of those scenes is depicted in my novel where they're asked to sing for the congregation. So I wanted not to end on that note, but to show you a picture of Waorani people today.
Oh, beautiful.
Isn't that beautiful? This picture was a celebration of activists in the streets of Puyo last summer because they won a major victory against the oil companies. They managed to reverse an oil auction on the same grounds that Indigenous people use in Canada, that they had not been properly consulted. And so some of their traditional territory was protected from oil development because of that victory. So I love that picture. And if anybody that's listening to this is interested in knowing more about that activism, there's websites like Amazon Frontlines that trace this activism, and you can support it and so on.
There's a powerful line in the novel where someone says to David that they're ruining Waorani lands for 1 week of American oil.
Yeah.
That's what it's worth to them. Yeah. There's a scene where David says to his daughter Abby that he wants her to be the descendant of Elizabeth Elliot, and says, "You carry this history in your bones." And she thinks, what a terrifying concept. And that's another thing that resonated with me in our country. Like, do you feel that that's true? Do we carry history in our bones? And what do we do with that history we carry in our bones?
I think far more than we realize. I think we're all in people keep saying an inflection point, but we're all realizing the need to look at our history differently. And, I was telling you about this missions conference in Winnipeg this spring where Nate Saint's grandson came. A minister from a the principal of a Christian school in Winnipeg sent out a memo about that conference, and he used the term savage in it. He said that this family has ministered to the savage Auca, used that term. And, it just said to me how far we have not come.
Even the term Auca is very, very derogatory, and the fact that they called it Operation Auca tells you a lot about the mindset.
That's right. They didn't know the name that the Waorani called themselves, and so they were unwittingly using a Quechua term that was a derogatory term for all other forest peoples. So, they went in with rather profound ignorance of the Waorani people, for sure.
In the book, in the contemporary frame, some people are going to make a film about the operation and the massacre, and they're trying to get David and Abby involved. And David realizes that this film is going to be pitched to a secular audience, when so far the story has only been pitched to evangelical audiences. And he says, this project has the fingerprints of screw up all over it, I think is how he words it. But I thought, again, that's a metaphor for your book, because you're pitching the story to a secular audience for maybe from the first time some people encounter the story is through your novel. So how have you found the audience response? Has it been what you expected or different?
I expected people to find it a little tough going in terms of the religious mindset. And I'm amazed and gratified. I love the responses I've heard, that people are not necessarily put off by entering the psyche of characters who are, referring to God with every second thought. I've actually been thrilled with how receptive people have been to this book, and how they've read it, and the connections they've made to contemporary times too. It's been great.
Wonderful.
I've had some fantastic times in book clubs, because, as you say, there is so much to talk about here.
Oh, this is a dream book club book. It's perfect. There's so much to talk about.
Yeah, and I should add that that's not limited to people who are strangers to the story. I've spoken to a couple of book clubs with people where the members had grown up with this story, and in one case, the book club was attached to a church. And I was so moved by how open-hearted they were to this. I've also spoken to a class at a Bible college, and they, it was very gratifying. It was humbling. It's not like I'm coming to this story as the only one who is looking for the truth and bombarding people over the heads with it. There seemed to me to be a readiness to hear what this story says, to reinvestigate or interrogate the mythology that has prevailed.
It seems very timely in that way.
Yeah.
One more question I have, and then we'll turn it over to the Q&A. I haven't seen anything on the chat, so I hope that just means that everybody is fine, not that my chat's not working. But my last question, another line that jumped out at me near the end that gave me pause was, "You can endure anything if you think the whole world is watching." Do you remember writing that line?
I do remember. I remember it just sort of landing with a thud in my mind. And I think there was always a consciousness that they were models to the rest of the world in this mission. Yeah.
Because there's very little talk of hardship. Like you say, there's a lot of talk of what God wants and trying to figure out what God is trying to tell them to do, and confusion when the radio signal with God isn't as clear as they would like it to be. But there's not really a lot of talk of the hardship, because they feel this is their story, and they feel everybody's watching them. And
and I think that was part of the culture of mission work at that time too. And I think especially of Rachel Sain as a single woman, it was always, I always thought it was really tough that single women so much was expected of them when they went to other communities to work, and yet they were never allowed to speak in churches at home. It was kind of ironic. And we're not necessarily highly respected. So you have to admire
they're not only not allowed to speak in their church, but they're not even allowed to sing. It says we sing in our hearts.
Well, that was true of some Plymouth Brethren churches, and so all of Fleming at the beginning was in a Plymouth Brethren church. I don't think it was even true of all by any means, but I found that kind of powerful.
We have some questions popping up, so I will read them. You say you had several pages of one character. Did you have those pages included in the book and you had to edit it?
Yes. So I actually took out two big things from this book. I had maybe 30 other pages of Rachel in the hacienda when she was with Dayuma, and it felt like it was just going off in a direction that, I was going to get lost. So I ended up taking that out on my own. But when the book went out to the publisher, it had a really long section with Abby at the beginning, and I ended up taking probably 40 pages out there. And I was helpless. My agent and I both knew that this was too long, and we couldn't seem to figure out what to do with it. But my editor just said, you need this scene, and this scene. She just picked out the most important elements. And I went with that, and I'm very grateful because I think it moved us more quickly into the story.
And then what you leave with Dayumi is so powerful and so central to the theme. So probably maybe you had to write that all to get what you got, but then
Maybe, yeah.
I would be irrevocably changed writing a book of this importance. Someone says, I certainly was in reading it. Did it change you in any way? That's a great question.
It is a great question. And I would say yes, to my surprise, because I kind of thought that this mindset was several decades in my past. And it just brought home to me how much, as Abby says, this sort of thinking is in your bones. Like, as I was writing, I didn't have to, go and stop and look up Bible verses in a concordance. They're all there because I memorized them as a child. So it made me very aware of how much that kind of thinking sticks. And it made me, I don't know, it just made me question and move beyond certain things, I think. And I felt writing it, I felt the old respect that I had felt as a young person for these women, and it felt audacious to be questioning it. And so, sometimes it's important to be audacious and to go into these old, previously held mythologies. And, I felt that it required me to do that.
But yet, so you're being audacious by going into but then you didn't want to meet the grandchild of the innate saint. You felt that made you nervous?
I'm not sure what would have been gained. I mean, he frames that mission in the same way that they did 2 generations ago. And I don't see my role really as arguing with people with that mindset. So I wasn't sure what would be gained.
Yeah. Joan's comment on the struggle between observation and faith, how it causes stress in our lives, illustrates, as does the book, how humans will reject fact that does not conform with their truths. So interesting. As you were writing, did you make connections to contemporary pockets of entrenched belief?
Oh, yeah.
Good question. Truth is
so much. Yeah. And I think we are all kind of broadsided by the way that misinformation and ideology and cultish devotion to a certain political perspective is prevailing today. And I don't know. I look at the kind of indoctrination that people have in religion as young people, and I don't set myself up as being rabidly anti-religion, but I just think in some ways it kind of conditions you to accept things that are not rational and don't fit with empirical evidence. And we're kind of seeing that socially, probably in a wider way.
Yeah. The next question is, I'm wondering if Joan could say a bit more about the ending and what she intended with it.
I guess I was interested in Abby's journey, and I didn't want to be too pat about it, that she, found some absolute liberation. I think it is a long journey. And, there's this little mention of her getting a tattoo, the meaning of which is shifting. And I think for all of us, our understanding of life shifts, and it's partly a question of being open to that. But I liked the ending myself. I liked her connection with a friend there that, to whom she can speak honestly. And as a couple of readers have observed to me, and I wasn't even conscious as I wrote it, I like the fact that she's locked out of her dad's house at the end. She's in the backyard. She sort of comes to meet him, but there's no meeting possible at that point. So I must say, I find beginnings of novels hard, but the endings usually just come to me and I don't question them too much, and I don't necessarily entirely understand their impact until sometime later. So you might be able to tell me more what the ending means than I can say myself.
That's a reader's question, right? Did you? I heard Delia Owens speak at the San Miguel Festival in February, and her book goes back and forth in time frames, similar to yours. But she said she wrote the whole thing chronologically, and then cut it up into pieces and split it around afterwards for effect. Did you write this chronologically, or did you write it the way it came?
I started with I wrote Olive and Rachel, and then I went back and wrote the beginning stuff about Abby and Dave. And then from that point, it was chronological. I fought for a long time against, like, this book is almost like 7 novellas. There's 7 points of view, and these points of view are not woven. Each one will be, 40 or 50 pages. And I fought against that for a long time. I thought that readers would not like parting company with one character and then, giving up and moving to another. And I think it's true. As a reader, you resist that a little bit. But it seemed to be ultimately the way to go, so that the baton of the story is passed from one character to the next. And I like the way characters, once they've been set up in their own novella, they will reappear in somebody else's story, and you have a different take on them. I enjoyed doing that.
I didn't think of it as novellas when I was reading, and I didn't think of the point of views being that far apart, because you keep seeing the characters. So I didn't notice that. So it certainly didn't bother me, I can tell you. The next question is, I'm wondering if Joan could say a bit more. Oh no, I already read that one. Speaking from the Canadian perspective, how important to you was it to awaken readers to any ways in which the story mirrors colonization in Canada?
I think that was kind of an implicit goal of mine. I think it's interesting that I felt more motivated to write about this mission enterprise than to write about any possible story about my family, say, as settlers on the prairies, and our relationship with Indigenous people. It seemed to me that this is kind of sharper to me in terms of my own experience of colonization, because I grew up hearing so much about it, and that this kind of intrusion into Indigenous lives was accepted in my growing up. So in a way, it was a sharper experience for me of colonization. And but for sure, there's a lot of resonance between the two, a lot of the same principles happening. And I guess it strikes me that this is so recent. Like, much of the story of first contact between Europeans and Indigenous people in North America was a long time ago, but this was 1956. So it is quite striking. But it's very recent.
And Abby draws the parallel at some point when she's talking about some land the government has set off for the Waharani people. She said, so basically a reserve. So it draws the parallel explicitly.
Right.
How do you master a non-judgmental voice is the next question. That's a good one. I'd like to know. If you could just tell us, please.
Well, I will confess that if there was any judgment, I felt as if Jim Elliot was a little bit caricatured in this book, and possibly Rachel Saint. No, I hope that I accorded her full humanity. How do I master it? I think anybody that writes in a third person limited, where you really have to sink into the character and identify it, I don't see room to judge them. You're just in them. You're in their voice. And so you never kind of speak with an author. You just try and track their thinking. And if there's going to be a counter or a foil to them, it seems to have to come from other people or through irony. And so I had, for example, Fray Alfredo, the Catholic friar, who was sort of embracing liberation theology and was really critical of the missionaries. And I created him because I needed somebody to stand up against the characters, but they were not criticizing themselves. And so I didn't criticize them in their voices.
I can learn so much from that. Thank you. Why did you choose the title Five Wives is the next question.
The title this book went out with was The Intangible Zone, which is a translation to English of the term used in Spanish for territories where Indigenous people in voluntary isolation live. They call it the intangible zone because you're not supposed to go in and you're not supposed to have contact with them. But I like the way the word plays in English. It's a little bit different. So that was my title when the book went out, but it's a little bit abstract. And HarperCollins said, no, let's try again. So they asked me for some other ideas, and Five Wives was one of them.
I think I like the title. And I was tweeting about your book yesterday, and someone made the comparison to Women Talking by Miriam Taves, which I, for some reason, hadn't made that comparison myself, but it's an interesting one. Did that comparison, is it meaningful for you to compare those two books?
Yeah, for sure. It's we're both writing about these kind of hermetically sealed ideological pods and trying to get at I guess the wider humanity of the characters than what might often be acknowledged within them. Yeah.
Two Manitoba stars, Miriam Taves and Joan Thomas. Very nice. I have one more question and then we're done. But you had talked about that you chose very deliberately not to write from the point of view of the Waharani, and because you didn't want to appropriate voice or cultural appropriation, which I think is very interesting and probably the smart decision. I worry sometimes when I'm writing that if I imagine myself into one group of characters and not into the other character, then I might be objectifying them or othering them. And to make them as full and real as the rest of the characters, I do need to imagine my way into them. So I think whatever choice you make, you're giving and taking, there's something lost. Can you talk a bit about your decision and how you felt about it in the book in the end?
Yeah, that's very nicely articulated. It is a very complex question. And so what I've written is yet again another North American perspective on this mission, when really the important story here to tell or to hear would be the story of the Waharani people. That's absolutely true. But aside from any political decision I make about this, it's partly an artistic decision. I just can't imagine that I could credibly imagine the experience of people whose culture is so profoundly different than my own. Whereas the missionaries, I've never been a foreign missionary like this, but I sure felt like I got that mindset and that, I paid my dues in terms of writing it.
That seems like a wise decision. And for me, it's balanced when I think it's Abby who says, we don't know anything about the way these people live. It's so different than us. And here's some of what I learned about their culture. And there's like a half a page where there's that belief about people changing so much they become a new person in with a bunch of other interesting beliefs. So it's just like, here's a glimpse into who they are, but we don't know. I thought that was a good balance.
Yeah, I loved reading the anthropology books that I read, and I truly felt that it would take a lifetime to sink into that culture to understand how different the mindset was. It's there's such an identification with the wilderness and with nature, and even a sense of individual experience is different because of the cohesion of groups. And so, yeah, it was wonderful to read about it, but I would never attempt to represent it.
And you say it would take a lifetime to get to know, but I felt reading your book as you told it, I felt it must have taken a lifetime to write, because I really had a sense of how rich it was because of your research, both reading the accounts, reading the letters, looking at the pictures and the articles, traveling to Ecuador. And I had asked you when we talked how long this book took you to write, because it felt like it was quite an undertaking, and you said 5 years. So I will thank you for that 5 years. It's a beautiful, wonderful book, and thank you for sharing your time with us today.
Well, Angie, that was just a fantastic conversation. Really, I love the way you read the book. It was wonderful. And thank you so much to all of you who I can't see and who sent such good questions too. That was a joy.